So to have a little break and consider if what you're doing is worth doing, and I don't want to, depress anyone here. It's good to also consider and be aware of the responsible conduct of research. And specifically in the case of computation, one could talk about responsible computational research. And you can write, if you want, in the notes document what type of ethical or moral or legal issues that you might not even know that you have, or maybe you think that you have, but they're not issues at all. But in general, what is making you doubtful about your research? I wrote there, for example, that reproducibility, which we have mentioned many times, is something that kind of I feel that often in my past as a researcher that I had issues of reproducibility. What about you, Thomas? What is your kind
I
of
completely agree. Um, Either other people's stuff that I wanted to replicate or my own stuff. In both cases, I had issues with getting things to run again.
yeah? And you actually mentioned really well my own stuff because one could think that reproducibility is something, I'm trying to figure out the universal law of whatever. And it's good that other people repeat my experiment, but sometimes the issue is really that I was doing 6 months ago something and I was able to obtain some results, and I'm not able to rerun the same code anymore. Was it that the library has changed, the operating system has changed? So this is very common. I've seen it many times with my work, with other people's work. So a few of the topics that I will mention now, they cover or they show you ways on how to deal with reproducibility issues. And you kind of already got a glimpse of this when earlier we talked about Conda and the Conda environments. And now someone was just asking about Python 2, which is like traveling back in time and trying to reproduce or replicate something from the past. So it's impossible to cover everything exhaustively when it comes to research ethics and responsible conduct of research. So I will try to give you a very short 5 minutes intro, but this page has lots of links that ideally every researcher should check and read and be aware. The kind of conceptual framework that you can think of is the so-called normative cascade, which is how basically society works. You can understand that, or you maybe feel that there are these general ethics principles that can drive basically the creation of laws. In the ideal case, ethics, all the good ethical principles would overlap completely with the laws, but in practice, it is not like that. So there is never a full overlap between ethics and law. And then, of course, laws will cause the creation or will influence so-called research policies. So how the legislations stemming from the ethical principle will actually be applied in the work you need to do with research. And then at the end, of course, it's the actual researchers that are affected by the cascade. On the other hand, if the researchers notice that there are new issues, that the core ethical principle needs to be revised, they can together influence the cascade and go back at the beginning and change the ethical principles. So if we talk about the ethical principle, I'm not gonna talk, there's many ethical principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one example, but in the context of research, I hope that everyone here, if you are in Europe, you should all read this very short book, which is the ALEA European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. Basically, there's everything there. If you know that book by heart, you just need to apply that book, whether you do computational science, I don't know, artistic research, or whatever type of research activities that you're doing. The four principles of the ALEA Code of Conduct are reliability, ensuring basically the quality of your research, honesty, that what you develop and what you do can be basically audited by others. So again, we're kind of covering this type of reproducibility and transparency. And of course, respect is very important. Respect towards your colleagues, respect towards the administrator of your cluster, respect towards the people that you will encounter on your career, others, authors in other universities, and more in general, respects towards society and the ecosystem and so on. And finally, accountability, given that, you know, from the accountability for the research from the idea stage, the publication stage, and knowledge type of management and organization, which also requires, this type of relationship between supervisor and mentors and let's say junior researchers who are supervised and so on. So that is kind of the general level. And then from this core ethical principle, there are many legislations that apply to research. I will not go into the detail of any of these, but the typical case, maybe I can ask this actually to Thomas. Have you ever experienced in your work that some researcher thinks that they're not working with personal data, but actually they were processing personal data?
I would phrase it almost the other way around. Is there anything that's not personal data?
Exactly.
Uh, it, yeah, I think the biggest issue is with respect to personal data is that it's really, really difficult to define what exactly personal
Mhm.
data is, or rather, what does not constitute personal data anymore.
Yeah. I totally agree. It's very difficult to anonymize data, and we see this, very often with people who come and ask for help that they think that they're not processing personal data because whatever direct identifiers are missing. But if it's a data about an individual, then let's just agree that it's personal data rather than trying to mathematically demonstrate that the probability of re-identifying this person is whatever is your favorite threshold. But in general, again, here we don't have time and maybe we don't even have the energy to go through legislations, but at least this list that is mentioned here is something that you should be aware if your research kind of, applies in this with this type of data. And then, of course, from the core ethical principle to the legislation and regulations, we have the kind of national policies or even university level policies. So in the page, you find some links related to Aalto University, but if you're from other university, most likely you have the similar policy, whether it's about the ethical review, if that's what you need in your research, or open science policies, open data policies, code of conduct, and things like that. So then at the end, it's you, the researchers, who will, depending on the case, need to consider these policies and this legislation and maybe these core ethical principles and trying to do the best you can. What I want to stress here is that sometimes the best practices are some, how can I say, state that it will never be reached. And I really like that in this paper by Wilson 2017 that is linked here, they mention good enough computational practices in this case, because sometimes it's trying to avoid that type of sloppy practices, so that by adopting good enough practices, you can, do the best you can and maybe slowly adopt more good enough practices until you reach the best practices.
I would like to add that one problem with best practices is that very often to actually achieve best practices, you need multiple people working on the same
Mm,
thing. And one person doesn't have all the knowledge and very often also not the capabilities to do all things that would be best practice because it's just getting too much. So this concept of good enough practices is something that is quite important in my opinion.
I totally agree. In this figure here, I try to represent, this is not exhaustive. I'm sure there's more best practices in computational science and there's more how should we call them, worst practices. But in this continue, so basically in the green side we would have, that all the data is archived with the DOI. There is data versioning, we have protocols, registered protocols for data collection, version control for all the code, so for reproducibility, unit tests. You can add, all the things that also we have mentioned today earlier. And on the other hand, you really have this case that there are no backups, there's no documentation, no README file, no idea how to rerun things, no dependencies listed, no history log on which script was run before the other. So I'm not asking you now, Thomas, to disclose something sensitive, but if you put yourself in this type of continuum, or maybe let's rephrase this, if have you had experience of some worst practices, actually?
Okay. Um, I have myself been in the situation that I had code that was not documented well enough, and that where I then 2 years later was trying to think, okay, how did I do this? Where did I put the configuration files? Where did I do this and that? And needed to go back and not completely reinvent, but it took me quite some time to set this up again. Um, I have seen enough kind of bad things online from others where it's like, but the, this you're providing the data you're providing the data, but in formats that are completely unusable, and that essentially essentially it would feel kind of more honest to just not provide the data. Um, and I hope that I'm nowadays somewhere on the yellow to greenish border there, because yeah, I won't be always able to go through all the different things that should be on the list, because it's also quite a bit of things come with a lot of administrative work, which essentially means while you're doing the administrative work on a couple of things, you're not actually doing anything to progress the project that you have, and that's getting frustrating very quickly. So yeah,
I
it's
agree. And the administrative work is sometimes not even valued, meaning that, for example, I wrote this year this a single folder for all projects where all the researchers from the same group I've read and write, and basically this I've seen myself. I was part of this type of gigantic research folders where things, I don't know, more or less self-organized, but never really, nobody had the time to do this type of administrative work, even though the policies, whether they come from EU horizon or whether they come from Academy of Finland, they kind of stress the importance of managing the data and managing the software. But maybe you get a very good point earlier that when it's not anymore this type of single person job that needs to do everything from inventing the idea, collecting the data, writing the code, if it becomes a teamwork, that then you have the data steward, the research software engineer, and then it's the researchers, the expert can focus on their expertise, and then in the end, best practices and even administrative tasks can be
um,
taken care
just
of.
just along those lines. So I often see the problem that I would like to follow best practices, but the best practices are written down so vaguely that, uh, yeah, like you just said, they stress that you should care about data management. But how? What should you actually do? Um, these kind of really concrete guidelines, they are, at least to me, very often lacking.
Mm,
And when just to mention it again with the administrative stuff that is undervalued, you especially as a researcher that does something with personal data, you fill in the same data into 20 different forms to submit to 20 different places for approval. And it gets really frustrating. Why can't you just do this once? And everyone who wants to know something can extract from what you just submitted.
yeah,
So these are the kind of things that then lead to people not following protocol, not, yeah,
yeah. But I would say in
following best
general,
practice.
I feel that things are much better. I don't know if it's because I've been involved with these issues, but maybe there is more awareness in general among
I think it is
researchers
getting
and
better. Also because higher levels are enforcing it more.
mm, yeah, it's
And
good. All right, but basically to conclude, this page also has this a little mention of cybersecurity. And again, the point here, it's not to give a course on cybersecurity, and most likely your organization as a mandatory course on cybersecurity. What is very important that I often try to remind to our researchers is that they need to understand the classification of information, meaning that they need to understand whether it's a script, whether it's a piece of data, whether it's your internal note or the picture for the summer trip of the department. You need to understand, is it public data? Is it internal data? Is it confidential or is it secret? In general, you could assume that most of the work we do goes between the confidential or internal. If you are, for example, drafting a paper or still working on something that you're not ready to fully make public. But then, of course, there's also lots of public work that we do, whether it's our open source code, projects, web pages, and things like that. Maybe I would say that a minority of us need to work with secret data, but of course there are legislations, for example, when you need to reuse health data, so data that was collected for medical purposes, there are legislation that forces to be secret. Then in this last 3 minutes, we were discussing a few days ago that it's important to maybe mention what could be the issues, whether they are ethical or legal. It's a blurred of using generative AI in your daily work. Now here try to think of many types of issues, but to keep it short without you can read the whole thing yourself. In general, I see when it comes to computational science and to write code, that there could be this type of unwanted plagiarism issues that I might be that the generative AI might synthesize some code that is verbatim, some excerpt from a library, but then I might not realize this. Most likely, I would not start searching if that code is verbatim from a library. And then the issues becomes that maybe that library had a specific type of software license that wouldn't allow me to reuse it unless I also adopt the same license. There's no point here to go down to these details, but you can understand that there are multiple risks of using this type of generative AI without carefully considering basically the output. So again, if you are so-called vibe coding afternoon project because you just want to make some funny cat pictures through some code, maybe it's okay. But if you write in the core functions for your research analysis and you are not sure if the output from this generative AI system is actually the actual output that you need to reconsider or maybe ask for help from other experts for doing code review and things like that. Maybe one that I like to mention is recently they noticed that when you work, for example, with Python, you might need to import some NumPy or pandas or whatever. And if you don't have them in your system, you need to pip install NumPy, Panda, and so on. And recently there are some consistent hallucinations of packages. And then in the Python ecosystem, but also in many other languages, there is this type of typo squatting, so that malicious people actually have created packages with a similar name, and then you do a typo when or the generative AI does a typo, and then suddenly you have basically, some malware installed in your system.
Um, I would like to add something that also recently came up when it comes to tools using allowing the LLM to collect and process additional data or additional public data, um, and particularly if that same thing also allows the model to access some private information, because there have been recent attacks where essentially the public data that was consumed by the LLM contained instructions to the LLM, at which point it generated content that, when you looked at it, had image links or things in there that essentially were leaking private information. So
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good
this
point.
essentially. my nowadays recommendation is assume that the LLM is just another human, a random human, and think about whether you want to give it access to whatever you are currently giving it access to, and that includes the whole conversation that you're currently having with it.
Yeah. I had to quote this. It's not Richard's quote, but Richard often says this, that there is no cloud computing. It's just someone else's computer. And in my opinion, it's the whole point, because unless you run these LLMs locally and truly locally in your machine, you're just sending data to somebody else's computer. And even if they promise, don't worry, we will never give this data to anyone. In it's
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. All right, but hopefully this was motivational enough to think if what you're doing is good, is right, is moral, is ethical, is legal, and so on. Feel free to write something in the chat of this type of philosophical thoughts, but I guess it's time for a break, and then later we can go back to code and computing. Thank you, Thomas, for the nice conversation.
Problem.
And I guess see you in 10 minutes. I don't see any clock now, so 12, yeah. Bye.